Hey, it's Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about the philosopher of science Karl Popper. Karl Popper is interesting, and his fields of study incorporated political philosophy as well as the philosophy of science. He's most notably famous as a philosopher of science, though his political books are also influential. So, Karl Popper is interesting because he appears in the 20th century and he seems to go against the more traditional grain of a lot of previous philosophers and even philosophers of his time. His ideas tend to be pretty bold and radical, but in a way that doesn't move towards postmodernism or even modernism as might be expected. And I think that's one of the things that makes his philosophy interesting. There are many concepts that you could describe, but I'm going to focus on two concepts that have been influential to me, and that is his notion of historical determinism, as well as the other notion of critical rationalism. So, first off, historical determinism is basically the idea that history or the present is set according to its past. So the conditions of the present are set by the past. Karl Popper is an interesting thinker because he went against the grain of Hegel and Marx as well as Plato. Indeed, you could say that Karl Popper is a critic of both of these traditions, which often overlap at times in a modern understanding of philosophy. So, and the reason is because he felt, for instance, with Marx, that Marx was limiting our present possibilities by having his idea of historical materialism, the idea that everything is set up according to our economic structure. But it's interesting because Karl Popper is also very critical of the Platonic tradition of the form specifically because that is also seen as something that is too set, something that is too rigid and doesn't allow for possibilities. I think that Karl Popper is an interesting thinker in general and accomplishes a lot of ideas and expresses a lot of interesting ideas and accomplishes a lot of interesting things with his philosophy. And historical determinism has been something that I've thought about more recently and more curiously, and wondered if indeed Plato and Marx are limited by this idea. This is really big for me because I personally like to focus on possibilities and things that can happen, and I wouldn't want to limit my speculations to certain philosophies, such as historical determinism. Also, Karl Popper is a proponent of his idea of critical rationalism, which is a scientific approach. You may know Karl Popper by the idea of falsificationism. So the idea, according to Karl Popper, is that you don't set out to prove a theory. You don't set out to prove a theory to be right. You prove it to be wrong, because this works better with formulating science as a discipline and as a tradition. He's very critical of empiricism and thinks that empiricism is limiting. And I think that this is interesting, especially when thinking about the power of rationality and of rationalism itself. And I think there is a lot of depth with some of these ideas. He takes his cues from the pre-Socratics as well as even the Socratic tradition of the idea that your idea might be wrong, but that is an important part of the process and that's what you're trying to explore. Now, these are just two of his key ideas, but the question you might be asking, or the question I certainly ask myself, is what do we do with these ideas? It is difficult to know immediately, but I've given it some thought and I realized that I think some of his ideas are too critical. I think part of the problem with rationality is you can set out to prove anything. This is something that I believe was demonstrated very well by Roger Scruton when he talks about the rationalist tradition, as well as even thinkers such as Derrida, who Roger Scruton critiques. And Derrida was famous for arguing pretty much things that weren't necessarily baseless, but were ingrained and entwined with this web of reason that he was working within, and that made his arguments tenuous. I personally like Karl Popper, and he's been influential to me, especially when I was reading his book Conjectures and Refutations, which really quickly is the idea that you make a conjecture, you posit it, and then you reject it. You refute it. And I think that's interesting. But I do want to say that I think my main critique of Karl Popper is that he's too limiting with his critical ideas and his critical eye. I think sometimes Ironically, by undertaking a rationalist approach, you can be too critical of ideas, and it can get really limiting. Nonetheless, I think Karl Popper is an interesting writer and a philosopher of the 20th century, and I think he offered a lot of interesting things. So I would certainly recommend him for your reading list and to check out. Anyway, this is Phoenix, and thank you for listening. Talk to you next time.